Hello, I'm Khalid Hamid, the International Director at CIPFA, and I'm very, very grateful and honoured to be joined by Sir Jon Thompson, who's the CEO at the Financial Reporting Council. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us today, John, and giving us time to talk about internal audit. But before we do, I think it's incumbent upon us to ask you yourself to tell us a little bit about your career today and what you've been doing in respect to specifically the public sector.
Yeah, certainly. So I am a CIPFA member. I'm also a member of CIMA. I have a career which has been mostly in the public sector, not entirely. I started in local government. I did spend some time out with EY, but looking back into the public sector because we were doing audit and consulting, back into local government again, then into the civil service for a non-ministerial department, then up to the Department for Education as the Director General of Corporate Services. I then moved to be the Director General of Finance of the Ministry of Defence, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, which is the Chief Civilian's job, and then the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And then nearly 3 years ago in 2019, I came here as the Chief Executive of the Financial Reporting Council. So a deep and heavy finance career, double qualified accountant, been around the block.
Certainly have. So I'm sure your insights are going to be more than interesting. So as you might know, CIPFA has recently published a major report, and we called it Internal Audit, Untapped Potential. And it forms a snapshot of the state of internal audit here in the UK public sector and explores where it's making its impact and what future holds for the profession. There were 800 respondees in and around the professional area of internal audit. And we also had a number of roundtable discussions. And as someone who's worked in the public sector for most of your career, including, as you mentioned, HRC, HRMC and the Ministry of Defence, what role does good governance and assurance play in those giants of the public sector? And can you tell us a little bit about a time when internal audit actually delivered a big thing?
Well, look, I wouldn't have said what I'm about to say before I became the regulator, but you have to go back to the Corporate Governance Code for the UK. Section 1 of the Corporate Governance Code sets out 5 principles around what defines good governance at the board level, and that includes risk management, performance management, and internal control. Those are fundamental responsibilities of the board, and the only way the board can exercise those responsibilities is to have a good governance system and the associated other disciplines that go around good governance, like risk and performance management and measuring performance, key performance indicators, all of those kinds of disciplines that finance professionals are fully familiar with. So if you're going to be a successful organization, then you do need to have robust and effective management and governance of your organization, which results in various assurances given by the organization to its stakeholders, shareholders, or wherever else you want, and is transparently reported in the annual report. Most of us use a 3 lines of defense model, and I'm sure that you're going to talk about that. I didn't quite catch your second question.
So in terms of that area where you've got the second line, you've got the good governance and you've got the responsibility of management to provide assurance, can you give us an example of an area specifically where internal audit really added value in some of those big jobs in Ministry of Defence or in HMRC?
Yeah, so I'm not a great fan of internal audit being in the second line of defence. I think it's a third line of defence activity, and probably the single most significant thing that internal audit could do, and has done to me in several different roles, has been to say you're rather good at the sort of first level of defence with management and internal control and them operating risk management system, whatever, and you've got a strong third line, but you're missing the middle part of it. Whereas the assurance, for example, over management information. Anyone who's worked with me will know that I'm kind of obsessed by several things. One of which is the input of public money is for public services or public goods or public benefit in the round. And I want to understand the connection between those two. And so obviously what comes from that is is models which say, I'll give you this amount of money in order for you to be able to achieve these outcomes. And the way in which you operate as the chief executive of a big organisation like HMRC is to say, okay, we set out how much money you're going to get and what you're going to produce for it. Now I want to see the management information that tells us that. Internal audit on several occasions that I can think of has told me whether or not that management information is any good, where it could be further developed, how it could be further matured. That is some of the financial and performance information that you'll getting relate to your risk management system. Are all of these actually synchronized in some kind of coherent way and so on? That is tremendous added value to someone like a chief executive who's got limited time at any one point to focus on any one thing, wants to be able to pick up a management information pack and say, okay, I know all of the numbers are good, I know the underlying processes are good, I know this is a coherent set of information, I can read it and I can ask questions and I can move from there, because internal audits say it is. That's probably, I can think of that definitely in the Ministry of Defence and again at HMRC were kind of seminal moments where internal audit added to tremendous value.
Right, and I think that's really good insights. And one of the things in our report that sort of talks to that a little bit is that internal audit doesn't seem to be isn't really being allowed to maximise its full potential and impact in certain organisations in the public sector, and it doesn't really get the recognition it deserves in organisations sometimes. People might have views on internal audit. What do you think can be done about exactly? What do you think can be done about promoting that aspect of actually making them a critical partner in success of the assurance framework of your organisation?
Well, I think the challenge for public sector leaders is a complex one, right? If you're running a local authority, a health trust, a central government department, you're trying to juggle a huge number of variables about your organisation. But what primarily people are concerned about is, are we producing the outputs that we get public money for? Be that about, I don't know, local social services or local education services? Is it about throughput at the local hospital? Is it about improving the environment or running the passport service or whatever? And huge effort goes into the sort of achieving the strategic goals of an organisation, and chief executives are very focused on that, which is great. But the variable factor in my experience, and I say this having come up the finance route, is that by the time you reach the chief executive's level, your prior experience about some of these fundamental underpinning aspects of running an organization, risk management, performance management, internal control, internal audit, all of that varies quite significantly. And the problem, therefore, is some people absolutely totally do get this. It's a fundamental requirement of being a chief executive, but opinion varies, right? And if you're super busy and you're trying to rescue your hospital from being bankrupt or your local authority from being taken over and put into special measures, or that you're so consumed in having to deliver Brexit or COVID or whatever, then these things take they're lesser of a priority for you because you're trying to deal with that big substantive issue. And people, public sector leaders, are generally super busy people doing magnificent work, and this kind of falls down their agenda. And I can understand why that is. I mean, my background says I don't think it ever really has slipped down my agenda. I've always been slightly obsessed about some of these areas that you want to talk about. So I think that's the reality of where we are. So in the end, it needs to be a leadership issue for the relevant sector.
And I mean, on that, and as you were explaining, you can see that the complexity and the speed at which all these crises are coming at us, they're getting faster and faster. And in a world now of soaring inflation, cost of living crisis, the issues going on in Ukraine, all adding to pressures on households, and also therefore on the suppliers of public services such as public bodies, who have to continue to deliver the services. So they almost do more with less all the time, or certainly more with the same amount. When you got this situation of the dynamism that you're referring to in the picture, this is where governance and public sector audit, I suppose, becomes even more important to that, given that underlying sort of assurance, as you said earlier on. But how do you fit that kind of thing into this ever dynamic and complex and changing picture?
Well, you have to constantly reevaluate some of the fundamentals of your organisation. You know, what is the purpose of your organisation? What are we trying to achieve? What are our objectives? What are our priorities? What values do we stand for? And you can build models on the basis of all of that between, okay, those are all the things that we're trying to achieve. Here's the application of public money. Now, okay, what outputs do I get? Now, what happens is situation is quite dynamic, so you have to reevaluate your objectives or your priorities or whatever, and then you can reallocate the resources against that. It kind of sounds a bit simplistic, but I mean, that's the truth, is you can't just keep doing more and more and more for less. At some point you have to say, I was given enough money to do 15 things and 16 things, but there's a point at which I can't keep doing it. I can't do 18 things, so I have to prioritize. And this was particularly relevant, I think, at the Ministry of Defence, when we had to go through a process of saying we cannot do everything within the available pot of money, right? And there's some dynamism to this ever-changing situation. We need some flexibility on our resource planning and our risk management and so on to be able to accommodate the fact that this situation is changing and how we're applying our resources to achieve our outputs. And I mean, it sort of sounds fine in theory. The reality of doing that is really rather difficult, of course, because you have to say we are going to stop doing X, Y, or Z, or we're going to scale back A, B, and C in order to accommodate this new priority. But that's the reality of things. You can't just keep putting more and more on any organisations. You constantly have to reevaluate. And look, this is a perfectly natural behaviour in the private sector, and it's one that I think generally most public servants are. Excuse me. My watch appears to be talking to me. So this is a perfectly normal behaviour in the private sector, and you know, most public sector leaders are really rather good at it, and it continues to be a complex environment. If you went back 10 years, your list of things that are changed in recent times would have been different, but there still would have been that sort of dynamic knocking around.
Would you see a role for the internal auditor as a trusted, critical friend in that process?
Yes, look, I think resource allocation, resource prioritisation, making sure those methodologies are sound, that you can see the connectivity across a model, is definitely a role for internal audit. I mean, there's not like a standard way of doing that. It's not a standard process, or as far as I'm aware. The MOD's resource prioritisation model was one that we developed within the Ministry of Defence. Could that have been audited? Yeah, sure, of course it could, because it's a process. It has lots of data. It has some judgmental overlay to it, but there are models. You can trace it. You can audit it. You can see from forward to back how we exactly did things, how we decided things, what we decided to prioritise, what to deprioritise, and so on. Could that be audited? Yes. Could that give you some assurance about your underpinning process? Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not a great fan of limiting internal audit to particular areas. I'm quite happy for my lead internal audit to go wherever they want to go.
Well, thank you. Just moving on, because obviously I think many of us are aware of the forthcoming changes to the FRC, into the new regulator, the Audit, Reporting and Governance Authority. The system, particularly for CIPFA listeners, we're looking at a new system leading local audit. What are going to be the main differences between the two bodies, and how is the new regulator going to be better placed to help in the reform of the local audit sector and tackle our current issues of delays?
So it's worth understanding our role in relation to private sector audit first, because the answer to your question is then relatively straightforward. So in the private sector, we set the audit standards, we set the framework out, we regulate the audit firms themselves. The company appoints the auditor. We then do quality reviews of the work of external auditors. We put that together, we make it all transparent, we feed it back to them. There's a loop around between what are we discovering when we do audit quality reviews, as they're called, to how do you set the standards and so on and so forth. So end to end, in the private sector, we own the entire system apart from one thing, which is who appoints the auditor. Right? which is entirely a matter for companies under the Companies Act. Now, if you've got a regulator who can see the entirety of the system and all the players within the system, then they can stand back from that system and say, actually, what we need to do is change these standards, or we need to adjust the market like this, or you know, we need to actually give auditors some very specific feedback about how they report, or whatever, or you know, how they value intangible assets, or whatever it is. And when we opened some conversations on the back of the Redmond review, was reasonably apparent that that model could be replicated in local government, so that we could stand back, the phrase that's used there is about as a system leader, see the process end to end, not get involved in the appointment of individual auditors for individual local authorities, but we could do pretty much the rest of it, or oversee the rest of it. So we've already opened some conversations with various different other bodies about, well, are there parts of this system which could be changed, which could result in a different outcome for local government. So let me be transparent about the obvious one for that, which is, I mean, to be open about it, money. So over the last 5 years, my understanding is that external audit fees in local government have gone down by some significant margin because of the way in which the tendering process works. But in the private sector, they've been going up fairly significantly, around 5% per year for at least the last 5 years. So you've got a 30% growth in the audit fee on the private sector, and on the public sector, it's been commoditized, so the price is going down. Now, there's some rather interesting questions in there about what's really happening in this market. Is it actually, I was really bothered about the price of it, because actually in the private sector, the thing that really matters, the thing that companies care about, is the quality of the audit, the knowledge of the people who do their external audit. That's the top thing on their list. The cost of it is absolutely secondary, whereas in local government, one might observe that it's been slightly the other way around. And so that's kind of an example of where learning from one sector to another and observing how different parts of the system work, potentially we ought to have a look at that as an issue. But there are others in there too. You know, what standards are we actually looking for local authority accounts is a rather interesting question that involves a whole range of players, from the Treasury through CIPFA and on to others too. So you have to look at the standards and the delivery and the feedback and the quality. So being the system leader of local government seemed like a natural extension of ARGA, because it's the system leader for private sector audit. And you know, after you've got it into two sectors, you know, it's possible that ARGA could do that in other sectors too.
Right. No, thanks for that insightful and candid answer. And I think yeah, it's a very big issue in the local government space right now, as you can imagine, and many discussions going on. But if we take the situation of the audit and the role of audit, and you're thinking about, I always think about the two aspects at the same time. One, the complexity of transactions through technology and the different aspects of technology, and the expectations of, as COVID has also brought forward, of almost doing things in real time. And then at the same time, trying to correlate that with the fact that you're expected to cover more than just financial aspects, in terms of the non-financial, the social and the environmental aspects of the equity issues which organizations now have. You know, we're asking them to become super people, aren't we, really, in essence, or whatever. But what do you think the main changes to the audit profession are going to be over the next 4 or 5 years, based on these, you know, not small issues?
Well, look, I think it's possible to answer your question with both an external and an internal audit hat on, first of all. So and if I break down the sort of broadly the 3 points that you're making on the sort of technological advance transactional side, I mean, I think we are seeing and will continue to see the advance of technology that move us away from traditional approaches to auditing, which are about transactions and sampling and, you know, depth testing or whatever, into a sort of more of a whole systems approach. So I've got a piece of technology that can replicate the entire, I don't know, payroll system. It can use our various analytical tools, maybe some MI, and actually what it tells me is X, Y, or Z, right? When you're in a fundamentally different level of auditing, when you can move from transactions to the whole system. What does the whole system say? the whole finance system, the whole procure to pay system, the whole personnel system, and so on and so on and so forth. Right, that advance to in technology is being experimented with at significant scale by some of the big four, and it will undoubtedly come through the whole market, I think, including internal audit. And indeed, some CIPFA members will already be in this kind of space, already doing some of this, I'm sure. So technology, it seems to me, gives a big step forward in the levels of assurance that you can give over whole systems. In real time, well, it's possible you can do it in real time. Again, the use of technology would help, but I mean, it's also possible that we don't really. It's just a feature of the time. There may be some things to learn from COVID, and there may not. We certainly can see two things happening together here about the use of technology and trying to do something in real time. Stock taking with advanced uses of technology, drones, for example, has definitely taken some external audit techniques further forward. Yes, we need more assurance over the what we call non-financial reporting. So if we set aside the accounts, many organizations put out an awful lot of other data. What level of assurance is there over, for example, your carbon emissions? What level of assurance is there over how you're approaching cyber risk? These are kind of interesting examples that people are wrestling with. And this area, the whole kind of expansion into ESG and risk analysis and so on, is a fast moving environment. There are not yet global standards in relation to ESG. They are developing and they will develop fast, but they need to be developed on a global basis. Otherwise, what happens in various organisations in the UK will be different than France or Germany or the States or Australia. So we're seeing the developments from global standards. Those will be translated into national standards. They'll largely be on the private sector, but they will undoubtedly also flow into the public sector. You know, I'm sure we're all interested in what are the carbon emissions of large local authorities. But what we need, first of all, is a standard, so there's some consistency, and then we'll need, ultimately, they'll produce some data, and we'll need some assurance over that data, so everyone can go, okay, well, that's good. And what we are planning to do, and indeed the government has announced, is that the responsibility for deciding what assurance is required and who should it be obtained from would be the responsibility of the audit committee. Now we think that's the right decision, because companies are not all the same, organisations are not all the same, and you need the audit and risk committee or the audit committee to decide, where do I want assurance and who should I obtain that assurance from, which could include the external auditors, the internal auditors. It could include specialist assurance providers on some particular aspects of whatever the organisation is doing. So that's the broad landscape at the minute.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I can see that the idea that the audit, whether internal or external, is a resource you want to maximise the value of, and having someone like an audit committee overseeing that and making sure you're not getting duplication, rather than getting complementarity and also getting the most return on investment at the audit, makes a lot of sense. And the audit committee obviously would be very well placed for that. So that's just I just want to get any final thoughts from you, John, really, at this point. We're very grateful for your time and your and the opportunity to have had this discussion and the role of audit in the public sector. And would like to hear more from you, obviously, in future. But any other final comments or thoughts or reflections as a whole on the discussion we've had?
Well, look, I've read Identifying the Impact of Internal Audit. I mean, it has 4 significant conclusions. I personally would support all 4 of those conclusions, in particular the importance of assurance and management and audit committees deciding on assurance, and internal audit being seen as a vital player in the assurance landscape. But I think it's really important that what we don't do is mix up internal audit also being kind of risk managers and all that kind of stuff. We need internal audit firmly in the 3rd line of assurance. And I thought there were 4 great lessons in the report, and I would highly recommend it.
Thank you very much for your time, John.
No problem.
It's a pleasure. Thanks. Bye now.
Thanks.